Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Profit Minds podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch, creator of the Profit Minds Growth System, a unique blend of profit growth, productivity acceleration, and building robust business process for scale. In every episode, I interview entrepreneurs and small business owners from around the world with a unique story to tell. You can find the show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and more. Well, hello, everyone. Today, my guest is Christian Muntean, president of Vantage Consulting. And today, we're going to talk about how to grow intentionally as a leader. Welcome, Christian.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So as you know, the first question that I ask every guest, tell me your story.
Yeah. Well, my story is, at least as it relates to what I do, I'm from Anchorage, Alaska. That's where I was raised. And so I kind of had a little bit of a unique upbringing in that regard, but was always very interested in the world and what was going on and service and helping. And so, long story short, I ended up working in international disaster relief and development. And I worked in countries all over the world, worked in Africa and the Middle East and the Balkans and Indonesia and Latin America. And in that work, I discovered that you could be in projects that were very, very well funded, even overfunded projects, if you can imagine. In relatively secure, safe environments. And if our teams were not led well, and if our teams didn't get along well, it was very, very hard to be productive and to be successful in our work. On the other hand, we could be in underfunded projects in war zones. And if we were led well and our teams were led well, or we got along well, we were able to be very successful. And so I thought the work we were doing was important. And I didn't think it was good to leave success to chance, especially when so much of success seemed to tie into leadership. And so I became fascinated with leadership and with team dynamics and organizational dynamics. And that led into an academic focus and building a career in that space. So I've been consulting now and coaching and writing for just over 20 years in that space.
Yeah. And it all came out of an interesting observation that leadership matters.
Absolutely. Yeah, it matters. And I think many leaders make excuses for why things don't work, but oftentimes, ultimately, it comes down to what the leaders did or didn't do or how they approach things.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember now that I remember when I was working at IBM, there was a cartoon about, the effectiveness of the rowers in a canoe. And when it was a well-led canoe, obviously it went well, right?
Yeah.
And the leader always said when it went well, it was because of the crew. But when it didn't go well, it was also because of the crew, right?
Yeah.
But the problem was that the coxswain or the leader, right, wasn't calling out the strokes appropriately.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. I felt the work that we were doing was important, and there was just a strong tendency to throw people into leadership. Often in that dynamic, it was often just the last person standing, the last person around would get the role. But that happens in corporate structures as well, where just the most senior person, you've been here for a long time, you're a real loyal team member, you get the job, and don't screw up. And I think that's a really ineffective way to build leaders.
Yeah, I can't tell you because I worked for 30 years in high tech, and I can't tell you the number of times that the best engineer out of the group was promoted to be manager.
Right.
And it wasn't necessarily that he or she wanted it or that they had the right skills for it. I mean, particularly in the engineering realm,
Right.
We're not known for our, shall we call it, soft skills.
Right.
And so, yeah, it was just throw them into the deep end. Oh, you're the best engineer, therefore you must be the person that's best capable of running this team. And
that's a very classic, that or the best salesperson, the best money maker. And those are the two really primary methods into senior leadership, is being very technically proficient or being the best money maker. And, sometimes it works.
Yeah. So how do you make that transition? How do you talk to folks that are trying to make that from technical expert or from individual contributor to manager or leader, and do you separate management and leadership?
I do. I don't, some people make a big deal about the difference. I think there are very rare, maybe no instances where there's a true separation, where you have leaders that have zero management responsibility and managers that have zero leadership role. So I think it's usually a mix, and you lean more towards one or the other. I personally define managers as people who are responsible to maintain what is in a certain set of standards and to make sure it's replicated on a consistent basis. And then the leaders are more responsible for setting direction and achieving quality and maintaining alignment with culture and goals and vision and so on. But the reality is, it's very hard to be an effective leader with poor management skills. It's very hard to be an effective manager if you can't lead. So both are needed.
Yeah, I guess I would make a little bit of an argument there, in the sense that if you're a manager and not a good leader, if you have somebody above you who is, and you can follow them, that can make up for some of your lack of leadership skills, if you understand.
I think that if you have a good team and an ability to work with people that can fill in those gaps, then I think that can cover that. Between the two, if you have effective managers that are poorly led, it's going to be difficult to accomplish things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But on the other hand, there are lots and lots of in entrepreneurial dynamics too. It's very common that you have this inspiring vision and someone who is a leader that people want to follow, but they're such a squirrel as a person that they have a hard time staying focused and a hard time making things happen, that they can burn out their team and make it difficult to really accomplish growth. So I guess the reason I don't split hairs over it is I think they're both important. I think both are needed. And what I find is people will tend to place a premium on leadership and feel like that's the more important, valued position. And I find that you need both, and you need the right people in both positions or in carrying those roles or functions. And so that's what I find happens most of the time, is people start deciding, well, which of us is the leader, therefore more important. And I don't find that to be a lot of value in that conversation.
Yeah, because as you correctly pointed out, just because you can lead doesn't mean you can manage. And in fact, if you lead and can't manage, it can be as disastrous, perhaps even more disastrous than being a manager without leadership capabilities, right?
But you're
because
right,
at least
though.
When you're a manager, you can keep the status quo, right?
Right. And I think you're right, though. I think oftentimes no one person has all of the skill sets in place or the preferences. And so having teams, leadership teams, management teams, whatever language you want to use, that have the varying skill sets and knowing how to appreciate and work with those is it's a smart move.
And I've even been in teams where the leader actually reports to the manager, because you can lead from below.
Yeah.
Again, depending upon your personality, depending upon how you're leading, depending upon, if you're a technical leader, for example, you don't necessarily want the technical leader to be the manager.
Right. Yeah, I think there's different ways of structuring it. I work with a lot of companies that are held by other companies. And so oftentimes you'll have a leader who's, in the president's role, reporting to someone who's kind of managing at the holding company level. And so there's a lot of different ways of structuring it. I think ultimately is just making sure that however you structure it, it's the way that works for you, and that you can make it work.
And that both
yeah.
functions are there and effective.
They both have to be there. Yeah, you can't. Leadership or entrepreneurial kind of leadership or visionary, however you want to frame that.
Yeah.
It's really hard to sustain anything or build anything that lasts without the management structure underneath it. And then management structure just gets stagnant and kind of gets lost if it doesn't have, refreshed vision. So you need both. But to go back to your question of how I help people transition from that technical role, I mean, what I often do with my clients is go back and verify, is this move really the right move? And so I ask the individual that's being asked to move, like, do you feel sick to your stomach, or are you excited about this move? That's an important thing to at least know.
Sometimes it's hard to
really
tell the
wanting
difference, by the way. Yeah.
It can be hard to tell the difference, and nerves can be good. But some people just realize, like, I just don't want to do that job. And it's good to know that before you take the job. If someone just feels intimidated by it, then that's something that you can work on. On the other hand, sometimes senior teams are promoting the wrong person for various reasons. And I like to make sure that we really aren't setting people up to fail. We want to make sure that people can get wins in through their entire career. And not that you always win, but you want to put them in a position where they can, not, you don't want to set up for the Peter principle where you've promoted them out of their level of competency. And so, and that does happen frequently. On the other hand, if somebody has the capacity and they have the interest, and there's like a basic level of capacity, I believe that leadership is more learned than, I believe it's more nature than nurture. I think it's something you can, let me frame that differently. I think it's more nurture than nature, the other way around.
I was going to say, yeah.
And so I don't think it's necessarily how you're born. I think it's a way that you interact with other people and relate to other people, and that can be learned. Some people may naturally be better at it, but I think that anybody can learn some level of leadership and improve their competency in that capacity. And so that's what I focus on. So what I really look for if I'm working with someone that's moving is, are you willing to try to change how you do things? Because you were a technical expert. You were an engineer over here. Maybe were the smartest person in the room. Maybe you were inventing things that no one else had ever created. Now you're moving into a role that is a completely different skill set, or largely a different skill set. We can transfer some of the engineering perspectives over and so on, but are you willing to learn something new and to be kind of start over and no longer be the expert? And if they are, we can accomplish all kinds of things.
Yeah. So what does that investment look like, investing in leadership development? What is that? How does that play out for the person that's trying to make that transition?
You mean like, what do they need to do, or
what are the kinds of things that you work on with them?
Yeah. So I offer a couple of different things. One is I offer coaching, probably similar to yourself, for coaching and training, but I mostly offer coaching. And so we'll identify key behaviors that we'll work with through like a 360 process or interviews. We'll identify some focus areas. And that's a very effective tool for helping people grow. And it's a very pinpointed tool. I also walk people through leadership development process, which I've captured in my book there, Train to Lead. But the idea being, there are certain concepts and practices that if you put them into place, you can predictably grow. And as opposed to randomly grabbing a book off the shelf that somebody recommended to you about leadership, understanding which concepts fit better together and which concepts precede other ones in their ability to be exercised. For example, broadly speaking, working on self-management, your ability to manage your own energy and your own priorities and your own time, is a more important skill to get a grip on, maybe not perfect, but get better at, than working on higher level strategic skills, because you ultimately won't be able to manage an entire team if you struggle to manage yourself. You'll be constantly undermining the effectiveness of the team. And so I like to help walk people through kind of a stacked process of which skills and perspectives should come first. And if you do it that way, you'll be able to build faster.
Yeah, that's interesting. The self-management is an important aspect of leadership. I guess it's, or maybe I should say it's self-leadership.
Yeah. It's the ability to, really the ability under your own steam to get yourself from point A to point B, and that ties into priority management, energy management, the ability to follow through on things and not get distracted, the ability to exercise patience in the appropriate way, and other things that are tied into that, other mindsets that help undergird that. But especially in the entrepreneurial space, leaders can get stuck because things become hard, or they have to learn a skill set that's new or different, or a change is required that puts them out of their comfort zone, or it takes longer than wanted for an initiative to bear fruit. And so you get tired of waiting and you start something else. And then that ends up sucking energy away from what you should have just, it's like trying to grow a garden and then get in there and dig around the roots of the little sprouts and trying to get them to grow faster. Some things just require some time, and entrepreneurs can get impatient. They have a hard time. So they can unintentionally impede the success of their organizations just due to not knowing what do you just wait on, and the exercising the ability to do that.
Yeah, it's like, watching the tomatoes ripen in our garden, right? And pulling them off when they're still green because, it's been long enough.
Yeah.
I've waited long enough.
Right. Yep. Yeah. So I think there are, like, for example, the way the approach that I take really starts with the leader focusing not on skills, because oftentimes people will be brought from a technical position, and now they're in charge of running meetings and supervising people and supervising performance. But they struggle with different things. What I started noticing in my executive coaching, which is a large part of my practice, is that most of these executive coaches were running, larger companies, but they were wrestling with the really similar things, which had to do with personal confidence. It had to do with self-image issues. It had to do with managing anger, managing fear. Those two things were very common. And dealing with feeling overwhelmed and not having enough time and energy to accomplish what they want to accomplish. And so, but these are very basic. They're very common challenges, but they're also very basic life skills.
Yep.
How do you work on those things? But clearly, many successful people who have built real success haven't totally figured out how to manage those in their lives. And what I found is that these leaders would hit this ceiling where they couldn't get past it, and they develop interpretations for why that was. But the reason pretty much always came back to something in this space about how they had worked on themselves and built themselves as a person. Because usually this ceiling was self-imposed, is what I discovered. In some way, it was a self-imposed limit that they had created, or behaviors that they had built that caused other people to not allow more advancement for them. People that could control that. And so I found that really needs to be a foundation before you get into higher level leadership skills. You have to work on these foundational elements of self-image, of the influences you bring into your life, of the person of the leader, being the kind of person that can handle stress, that can handle conflict, that can handle anxiety, and not act out of that in a destructive way or unhelpful way, or other things, and not be too intimidated to pursue an opportunity.
And I'm wondering if that's the challenge for, I'll say, because again, most of my experience is in, high-tech companies, right? Mm-hmm. Where, and the organizations that I was in, mostly engineering functions.
Right.
And there's a certain amount of success in the engineering space that can come by simple, I won't say simple is the wrong word, but by brute force intellect. Right. And when you apply that brute force intellect to a group of people, it is not as effective.
Yeah, it doesn't work the same way. The thing that I see with engineering clients, most of the engineering clients I've worked with were more in the construction or civil space, but some similar mindsets in that. And what I find is that there's a very high need to be accurate and to be right. And the biggest struggle that, well, for example, I was working with an engineering firm. There was about 24 owners of this firm. And so I was helping them with strategic planning. And there's a visioning exercise that I usually do with clients. It takes typically about 45 minutes to an hour maximum. It's usually a fairly short exercise. And we were stuck on this exercise for hours and hours. Like, we couldn't get past it. And I couldn't figure out why this was so hard. And then it dawned on me that they all viewed this as an equation. Like, there was a right answer, a right vision out there that they all needed to arrive at if they were all doing the math properly. And they didn't really realize that leadership is really just about making a choice, a best guess choice. I mean, there's a high level of risk and ambiguity in leadership, and that discomfort with how do we choose a direction when you can't verify that you've picked the right answer and there is a risk associated with it, stop them. And we weren't able to really fully, meaningfully get past that. Reflecting it back to them was helpful, but they just kind of were at a point where if they didn't have the right answer for what their future needed to be, they didn't want to take a step, which is in itself, of course, a choice. But it was one that they stayed stuck in.
Yeah. That's very interesting. No, I can see that. And I can see that to some extent playing out in my own life, right? My perfectionist tendencies, I think I am sure a reflection of my scientific engineering sort of mindset.
Yeah, it could be. I also really struggled, less so now, but I was raised kind of to be a perfectionist. And I would say that was one of the biggest inhibitors of my success was this deep need to get things accurate and right, because there are things, I hope that the person designing and building a bridge is getting it right. But most of us and most leadership decisions will never be able to have that level of accuracy behind them. And they also don't need it. And most of leadership is more like an essay than a math problem. Like, you can kind of correct it as you go. And that's one of the benefits. You can't do that with a bridge. You can, but it's, risky and costly. But
yeah, I mean, you can make certain design modifications as you're putting it up, but once the screws are locked down, it's more challenging.
Once it's there,
to make
you don't want to test it and see how many cars made it over before it collapsed and then make your adjustments on it. You can do that with some things. In software, you can do that, obviously, beta testing things. But I think leadership, I guess the point back to perfectionism is oftentimes perfectionism, this is my theory on it, is that it's often based out of a fear of getting things wrong or somehow appearing wrong. And there's a place for a respect for accuracy. But what I found is it doesn't apply as broadly in life as I had originally thought. And as I started, like, one of the pieces of advice that helps unlock things for most of my clients, and it helped me out, which is I urge my clients to not aim for A's or A++ grades in their work, but aim for a B. It's still honor roll. It's still good enough. Aim for B quality work. Next time you come back, try to do it a little bit better. But the difference between B quality work and A quality work in most leadership work is going to be lost on the customers. It's going to be lost on your employees. Like, they're not going to be able to tell the difference. And it's not worth the extra effort it'll take to try to get there. And it may not even exist.
Or the delay in figuring out what an A looks like.
Exactly. Yeah. I have learned, part of this came from some friends of mine who are very successful at launching initiatives or endeavors or entrepreneurial efforts. And they've done a lot, built businesses, built nonprofits, written books, done all kinds of different things. And they just do it easily. It appears to be easy when they do it. I lived with them for a couple of years when I was in college, and I just noticed how comfortable they were being messy and launching things that weren't totally thought through. And at the time, that drove me up the wall. I thought this stuff's got to be figured out for all these different reasons. But what I found is I wasn't getting my things to launch, and they were regularly launching things and making things work. And eventually I just had to accept their way was more effective than mine. And so I began to appreciate, like, okay, there's something to, kind of that ready, fire, aim approach, and then make your adjustments and then try it again.
Yeah. Yeah. We have one of our daughters struggles with this, and we had to help her understand that done is better than perfect.
Yeah. Many times that is the case. I agree. There's an odd, I've noticed this with myself and with some of my clients, that can be a tendency to get almost done and then stop. And there's like a fear or an inhibition around pushing yourself through to completion, because maybe at that point, I don't know, there's going to be a judgment or an evaluation or an assessment or a perception of that. So people will get to it, but then not quite get across the line. And that's, as a mentor of mine says, a friend of mine, that success loves speed. And so just being quick to make things happen is a big driver of success.
Interesting. Yeah. The other thing that I find, for me anyway, is that once I know all of the steps, I'm on to the next thing, because, well, it's just an execution problem then, and that's boring.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So Christian.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No. Ask your question.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, you have a special gift that you can offer our listeners?
Oh yeah. If people go to my website at christianmuntean.com, I have tons and tons of free resources on that website, on leadership, on management, on teams, and so on. But there's also an assessment tied to my book, Train to Lead. And it's a free assessment, and you can go through that, and it'll help you self-reflect and identify maybe the top one or two areas that, if you focus on those, could produce some of the greatest growth in your leadership journey.
Well, that'd be incredibly valuable. Thanks for sharing that. And if people want to reach out, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Yeah, my website's also the best way. If you go there, there's a contact, a link, and you can reach out to me there. Again, at christianmuntean.com.
Yeah, and all of that will be in the show notes.
Great.
And that concludes our show. Thanks so much to my guest, Christian Muntean, president of Vantage Consulting. I hope you learned something about how to grow intentionally as a leader. I know I did. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Profit Minds podcast. This is your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch. Please visit www.profitminds.net for other episodes or to contact me. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others. Thanks for listening. Have a grateful day.